What does it mean to be human exactly? It's a serious question. And because when I was learning about the difference of different mammals and the biological structure of our world and everything and all of its classifications, I learned what humanity was supposed to be. I learned about genetics. I learned about Mendel. I learned about everything. Chromosomes, cellular division, fertility, reproduction, passing on those genes, etc., etc. And of course, we learned about the double-stranded helix. What if what we learned then was not the full story? Apparently, John Ramirez, if you're not familiar with him, he is ex-CIA and ex-Navy. And he's retired. And he has been given permission to selectively talk about some things but not others, including the existence of what he was discovering in his career. And there was a podcast that I came across recently on X where this happened 3 years ago to the date of this recording. John Ramirez spoke publicly about a symposium that he attended at some point in, I believe it was 2009, where he and other academics and other professionals, serious professionals, learned that humans at some point had been hybridized and that the genome had been edited, enhanced actually. And he made it very clear in the podcast to state that the verbiage around this was that selective enhancements were made. It wasn't like there was an intervention. It wasn't like there was control or manipulation. It was humanity itself was enhanced. And later on in the podcast, he goes on to say something about that event happening well before he found out about it in 2009. And how in certain circles, it was just known knowledge. If you were in the know, you were in the know. But when I was studying for my undergraduate and my PhD, I was not one of those people in the know. No, I was not. So I never learned about humans being modified and hybridized with any sort of, quote, foreign DNA. Or, well, I shouldn't say quote, because I don't know if he described it like that. He may have said alien, which I think is a little pejorative, personally, because it reinforces this fear between other and us, which reinforces this deep underlying discomfort and cognitive dissonance that we might not exist in this world as we were trained and taught to be. And that raises a lot of feelings of anxiety for some people, not others, depending on how far along you are in your awakening journey. But it can be so challenging to digest that many people will just stop right here, or will discard it and discredit it. And so as a result, when we start to understand the nature of reality and what it means to be human, we get to these bigger questions of how do we think about these concepts that we have spent years studying that might not be the whole picture. John Ramirez set a date, but it wasn't clear to me because the podcaster and he didn't expound on this. And it was a little bit later in the presentation. And they had talked about some other subjects in between. So I wasn't entirely clear if somebody in the symposium said this date, but that it had somehow, this editing happened 70,000 years ago. But I also remember him talking about there being hybridization. What I thought when I was listening to him being done in our generations. So I'm not clear on the details. I'm not an expert. I'm going to link the podcast for you if you want to listen to it in the comments. And what I find more interesting is he mentions this whole system of knowledge in our schools may be a lie. And I've heard other people talk about this before, but I haven't really bought into it, first of all. And so when you see somebody that's representing a former, like a former person representing a pretty serious job title and professional career, shows his diploma, has his credentials verified by the producer of the show in private, and is known, just has this impression, if you have been in the metaphysical circles a little bit, is known to be legitimate and credible. And so to have somebody espouse that this body of knowledge that we've all been trained on may be omitting key details and could be a lie in of itself, and the stories that we've been told may just be stories, and keeping us in this illusion of an experience that we collectively call the human experience, because that's what we were told to call it. And we were given the definitions and the words and the language. Something has always perplexed me, and perhaps you as well. I know I have some deep thinkers who listen. I've never understood how the root languages were organized and created. And I've never understood how these people who were seemingly so scattered and disorganized and illiterate could form a language. And then that be disseminated as root languages. Like when you think about the psychology and the motivation of people, it just doesn't make sense to me how so many languages across the world can actually be so similar to how the architecture across the world can be so similar at a time where there were horse and buggies. Like, how did these origin events in culture come to be? And I've had a lot of questions about old history and some of the, quote, mud floods and the orphan trains, and looking through the historical documents and the photos, allegedly, of course. Everything on the internet is suspect, but when you look through some of the lore and some of the fan fiction, if we want to discard everything, or perhaps some of the recovered documents showcasing impossible feats of humanity that, when there was no collective communications or broadcast or capabilities, somehow harness the same technology to build these amazing things and to do these amazing feats that don't really make sense, actually, when you think how the world was structured, supposedly, at that time. And I've always thought, for the orphan trains, if you want a rabbit hole, it's worth going down if you're not familiar with them. When you look at some of the photographs of that time, it's almost like they bust in people who just walked out of a lab, that walked out of a clone farm. And they're strangely looking around at these buildings that were constructed with this awe, like they've never seen anything like it, and given the same clothes and the same hats. And I've always wondered, who was populating the stores? Who was populating the people, like the docks? Like, who were the origin NPCs or the people that were there. So when we think about hybridization and we think about the narrative structure of what it means to be human, it also raises important questions of where are we exactly? What type of facility or world or program are we living in? And in this podcast with John Ramirez, the podcaster, I'm not familiar with him, but apparently he was interviewing somebody else who was legitimate. And this other person said that to these other species, we were like a petri dish. And as though they were introducing things into our environment to see what would happen. So kind of like an experimental approach. This is all second, third-hand information. Again, you want to listen to the podcast yourself. It's available in the comments if you want to, but you don't have to. This is my takeaway. So understanding that regardless of whether these particular testimonies are true, there is a slew of data which is emerging and has been trying to emerge that, yes, on one hand, we could say is a false flag, right? Because there is evidence of some people suggesting that in order to increase the domination and control of people, to scare them by releasing in a slow drip fashion things that will rock their world. So they will say yes to things like perhaps transhumanism and unethical transhumanism because they're so frightened. Having had my own personal experiences before I learned about any of this, I am actually excited because some of my best reality structures are where human hybrids exist. And I've known that I was a hybrid in these lifelines. But in the world that I came from as an unawake, unevolved human that was entrenched in binary reductionist materialist schooling, which may or may not be subject for debate or scrutiny, depending on what perspective you're viewing things from, I was clueless about all of this. So I just always classified myself as a human. I've always classified myself as a human until my awakening journey. And I've often wondered if the, quote, spiritual awakening was actually a physiological change that resulted due to some epigenetic shifts in my biology that allowed certain abilities to come online, as you may have also experienced if you've had one of these awakenings. And so we call it a spiritual awakening because that's what we're told to call it, much like we're told to see ourselves as human because that's how we are taught to see things and to talk about things. Going back to the source of language, we are given the schema and the thought modules and the culture. We are actually trained on how to exist in our world and in our society. And there's always someone to teach us. And generally speaking, the holders of this knowledge are people which exist in human form. Except when you start to have awakenings, and then you start to open up to other sources of information and communication, including telepathy with other beings or other creatures, or some people feel better communicating in a spiritual context. So they're a medium and they talk to loved ones and angels and deities. It all depends on the framework, but these frameworks are actually derived from our culture, which was given to us. And so now go back to the false flag for a moment. what has always bothered me about this argument is that it invokes a cognitive bias, in my personal opinion, that I believe is a weakness to our species. I'm just speaking very honestly here. When you tell somebody that there's an existence of a plan to frighten them and terrify them, that aliens exist and they're going to do bad things, and then you learn about the holographic Project Bluebeam, which is a real project apparently, and you learn about the PSYOP that apparently is going to control people's minds, then when anybody starts talking about aliens, they automatically bucket it into the false flag argument. Because if they buy into that, and there's enough compelling evidence that most people, when you do that level of research, will, right? So when you believe that, then that creates this system error, cognitive error, in my opinion, that then precludes the ability to process any other information surrounding it, because it's automatically just assumed that it's going to be fake. But as Dr. Greer shows, and others, there can be the existence of other forms and species and beings, and there can also be a false flag, PSYOP. They're not mutually exclusive. And so when humans are capitalized on with these cognitive biases, it creates a lot of confusion and a lot of resistances that I believe need to actually be upgraded if we are going to continue on as a species, because it makes confusing us and trickery extremely easy. Extremely easy. Just like if you take children and you set them down in a classroom and you say, well, this is what a human is. And you reinforce this over and over and over again and police it, so to speak, then that's going to be rigidly housed as a conceptual framework that is very hard to deviate from, and can cause a lot of unprocessed emotions to arise that the individual does not have the skills to successfully work through. So it creates roadblocks in people's psychology in getting to the next point of evolution, assuming that we are moving to an intergalactic world, and perhaps we're not. Perhaps this side world is about staying in an M. Night Shyamalan movie. Sorry, I can't say that word again. That happened the last episode too. Except this time I'm not feeling embarrassment. This time I'm feeling other emotions, that it's like a feeling of conviction and frustration and disappointment and discouragement and hope and optimism, seeing this potentiality, but not knowing if we can get to it, because I feel that there are barriers to some of the most amazing futures that could be out there. Not that all of them would be amazing. They can exist in a spectrum, but we have to navigate to the ones that are amazing. And when we're all going down on a burning ship, running around like chicken with their heads cut off, denying the fact that actually it could be real, that we are hybrid, that we are alien hybrids, that they're not actually alien, that we are their prodigy. It could be that they all exist simultaneously, but it creates so much inability to function whenever people don't have the proper tools to cognitively and emotionally work through certain truths. So I see it like keeping us in the village, keeping us in a side world that is dominated by coal and antiquated tech. And just before I started recording, I heard an old-fashioned airplane, this burdensome motor that's just, announcing itself, like giving a cat with bells so you can hear it. Like cats like to be quiet, especially at night. So when you give a cat a bell, it's actually really bothersome for their sensory system. But we never think about that because we think about and prioritize our own perspective. And so we just put bells on our animals to make sure that we can always find them and never think about how they're actually feeling. Recently, I went to the zoo and saw this chimpanzee cowering down by the waterfall with its fingers in its ears and its head buried into the crevice of a rock. And it looked like it was miserable because of the sound and the sensory information that it was processing all the time. And so, being a sensitive being, and we usually become more sensitive when we awaken as hybrids, it's awful to live in a motorized world that is dirty and polluted and environmentally unconscious, and to feel as though we have bells on us. We can't move without being detected. And the way that the world is constructed, like the houses are just the materials, and it's just the energy of everything is dead. It's actually dead. And half the food that we eat in the United States, especially when it comes from a box, is dead food. It's actually dead. It has no life in it. But I'm getting off track. So, feeling as though that there is an opportunity for a different way of life, and feeling that calling brings up many emotions, because when you've had a taste of freedom and what potentials can feel like, and to feel that the burden of fear is what holds people back, and the repetitive onslaught of propaganda, to where the only narrative in people's minds, especially when we talk about something like transhumanism, again, at least where I'm at, and the audience that, again, drops off week after week, it's okay. I still love you guys. You can come back whenever you want when I'm not talking about things that are very challenging. That's okay. But it's disheartening from the perspective that it doesn't have to only be that way, but we have to create a different outcome. We actually have to use our thought energy, our designing ideas, our creativity, our fire, our passion, our conviction, our everything. And we have to actually create. We have to invest ourselves, our time, our energy, and money into creating different worlds. But all I see in the manifestation, spiritual awakening pools, cesspools, sometimes they're just cesspools. They're just a different flavor of unconsciousness. In my personal opinion, not all of them, but Facebook, I don't even know what is going on there. There's like a collection of cesspools of people that call themselves healers and spiritual advocates, and it's literally just a recapitulation of unconsciousness and entitlement. Sometimes, not all the time, there are some great people on there. It's just a different flavor of the same thing. The patterns are just always there. And those are the people I think we do need to have bells on, just being honest. So I'm not opposed to putting bells on cats, but I believe that it's important to understand the why, and to create a system for the cats to say, don't do that, please. I'm ready to take the bell off. And to show them a different world, a different way of life. Because you can give a cat a different existence. You can give a chimpanzee a different existence, even at a zoo. And what I see in the manifestation culture is people hyper-focused on surviving, their bank account, love, happiness, prosperity, making it in their life, their singular existence, that many of them, that's all they remember and that's all they have. So of course they hold very tightly onto it. And we need people to be manifesting worlds and different collectives. And unfortunately, when we don't do that and we don't manifest together, then we lose an opportunity, because there are those out there that understand this principle. And so when we are fractured and focused on our singular existence, even at the expense of others, and nobody's perfect, of course, it is a learning process. But it's surprising to me how many people don't really consider the collective. They don't really consider even their actions. They don't necessarily want to support or bring up other people in their group. It's wild. So what I've seen on Facebook is wild. So as a result, when we can't process the information emotionally because we're so overwhelmed or buried in fear, or we can't intellectually digest it, it locks us up. And that, in conjunction with the resistance and the inclination of humans to want to stay in the known, means that we have an opportunity that is lost. Because when we can digest it, when we can take a deep breath and confront it, we can start to ask more important questions like, okay, if humans are not as simple as we were originally thinking with the 5 basic senses, right? Then what kind of superpowers might we have? And what kind of worlds could we create? Because here is the beautiful thing that I believe that we can carry through. Humans are some of the most artistic and creative and beautiful creatures. So when we take a new recipe, a new potential recipe, and we ask a chef to make something great, and that chef is a master of their craft, master designer, master engineer, a master systems builder, a master poet or artist, and we say, what would you manifest now with your unique skills and abilities? And how would you contribute to a different standard of living, to a different world? This is what I believe transhumanism, ethical transhumanism, being human 2.0 is about. It's about understanding what is our hybrid DNA. What are our special abilities, if we have them, online? And if not, how do we access them and develop them? Because some people do have some of them. What options do we have to upgrade parts of ourselves, our cognition, our strength, our power, our physique, our form, our genes? That is what I believe being a sovereign, hybridized human is about. Taking the little bell off and saying, I want a different habitat.